Hello, I'm Wilma Jensen. I was choir master organist at St. George's Episcopal Church in Nashville, Tennessee for 20 years. And since that time, I've continued to play recitals and conduct some workshops, and as well as study some. And I've had the privilege of performing on some beautiful instruments around the world. I would like to tell you about some of my recent adventures. I played at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. I had always wanted to play there because I heard the acoustics were so fabulous. So when I looked at the dates, I noticed that March 8th was on the list that I could choose from, and that's my birthday. I had already given a recital for my 90th birthday at St. George's, at which I had a lot of returning soloists and instrumentalists in the choir singing. So when I saw that my birthday was there, I thought, well, I could play my 91st birthday at St. John the Divine. So that's what I did. I chose a program that had two pieces in memoriam, one for Alec Whiten, the former choir director organist, and one for Stephen Lawson, a former student of mine who was a New York organist. Then I chose to play the Franck Grand Pièce Symphonique as the closing composition for the program, which was wonderful for that room because there would be a fermata at the end of a phrase, and that meant that I could hold the fermata as long as I want and then just listen to the reverberation after the release. And then there would be sometimes at the end of the phrase, there would be a whole measure rest. So again, that could be fairly free and we could listen to the reverberation. After my schooling at Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, I started developing a year or two later some tension in my wrist and a heavy thumb. So I went to a fabulous teacher in Oklahoma City whose name was Ernestine Scott. And I not only studied with her, but she took me to master classes, and I even heard a lecture by Adele Marcus, the famous pianist from Juilliard, who had such influence on pianists and in how to develop natural physical gestures. And it was one of the most important workshops or lectures I ever heard in my life. And also Ernestine Scott started me reading many sources written by pianists, performers, and teachers. So I learned a great deal about how the hands were supposed to work. The Mate book, which she had me read first, says that there is really action of the finger and rotation. For instance, the fourth finger is attached to the third, and so it doesn't lift well all by itself. So you need to add some rotation. In your scale, when you play 3, then you can lift for 4 and rotate, and that makes the fourth finger, which is ordinarily weak, really quite strong. Of course, we all need to practice our scales. I remember one time I was practicing scales at the church and someone came through the dining hall where I was practicing on the Steinway and said, "You mean you still have to practice scales?" Well, of course. What you're doing is trying to find the most natural motions for those scales. And I think you can use quite a bit of motion. You know, all the organists say to touch the key before you play. But even Rameau said, when you're practicing your trill or an ornament slowly, lift every finger as high as possible. And I think that's a clue to me that when you're in slow practice, you should be having a more active finger. Now in scales, I'm going to think about when I'm going to rotate. I'm going to rotate to 4 because it needs that rotation from 3 to 4. I'm going to do this slowly. So the finger swings to the key, rotate to the thumb. And if you practice with the correct motions slowly, then when you are ready to go faster, it will be there. All the pianists say that when you play fast, then of course you're really close to the keys. But I think when you start slowly, you can exaggerate the motion, and then the motion will be better when you're fast for having done that slowly. I would like to read you a quote from Heinrich Schenker. It's about pushing ahead, holding back. A balanced tempo throughout a piece does not exclude freedom. Just as in dynamics, the contrast of pressure and release, light and shade, help to unify the piece. Similarly, in tempo, balance is established through the contrast of pushing ahead and holding back. And Schenker, in his scores, even puts an arrow ahead, meaning push ahead, get a little faster, or he puts the arrow back a little bit slower. When we're young, we're trying to get every eighth note exactly even, the same length. And we practice with the metronome. But then as we get farther along in our career, then it's time to get more musical, and we start not making all those notes even. But how you do that depends a lot on performance practice. Even though you see the page clearly, there's so much you have to know from what the composers or historians of the period have said about the music. I'd like to tell you about a phrase in Bach. You see the notes, which look quite easy on the page, but there's so much to know from performance practice. And that's not all in one book. It's from many, many sources of historians, organists, pedagogues. I'd like to show you this homage and tell you what I have to know in order to play that phrase properly. Okay. I'm sorry we're not using the organ, but Kelsey's going to play the pedal, the bass line. There are so many symbols in a score, and we need to know how to perform those. And we see what's called a mordent, which is the note in the note below. And André Issoire, who's French, he talked a lot about the pince, which is a mordent in French. The first note is pinned longer. That means when the organ grinder plays, and they have a treatise that tells how to put the pins to play it, that the first note is longer. Or it's like the beginning of the toccata and fugue in D minor, which everybody knows. So the first note, da, 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 you wouldn't want to hear it, da, da, da. It's too even. So when I come to this mordent, and then when you come to a trill, sometimes in the music, the last two notes are indicated in the score, the trill, and then the last two notes are, but they didn't perform it that way. The last two notes that go under the trill are performed at the same tempo, even though it's written slower than that. Same thing here, and you can stress the first note of a trill. You can get just a little faster, but it must be imperceptible. That's their word for it, imperceptible. We're trying to incorporate the performance practice that we should for this phrase. piano study, I learned to control different types of touches and have it explained in a way that I knew what I was trying to do. When you're legato, you're really just passing the weight on from finger to finger, and on a tracker organ, the control of going into the speed slowly makes a difference. If you're repeating a note, you want it to be there, almost to be no space between the repeat. And if you're stretching the line, there's a lot of rotation. Something like the arabesque of Vier and the 24 pieces in freestyle. You're passing the weight on. And you can use a lot of motion. It's almost like the wrist can become the conductor. You're not going to get in your own way since the composition is slow and you're just going with the flow of the phrase. In French classic music or French Baroque music, there's a performance practice called note inégale, and the organist is expected that when the notes are written evenly on the page, and especially when they're stepwise, that you play a long note, a shorter note. Long, short, long, short, long. And so forth. It's a little nicer than playing just da, 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 da. It has an elegance and a grace to it. From study of writings of pianists that clearly talk about what natural physical gestures are, one can develop a lot of improved controls. And this can enhance one's organ playing a great deal, add a lot of excitement, allow a lot of connection between legato passages. If you're doing a repeated note in a legato section, it's close to the key. There's practically no space between. If you're playing a Baroque piece, there's so much more articulation. The two John Laupvik books on performance practice in organ playing have been so incredibly valuable to us. He writes in detail about performance practice, quotes from many composers and historians. And when you can combine the control of different kind of touches and the physical gestures with the right information, it makes playing so much stylistically improved. I'm always looking for new quotes about performance practice. It's wonderful when the composer tells you how you should play his piece or her piece. I thank you all for listening, and now I must go back to practicing.